The train rattled through the Georgia pines, carrying Joseph Carter home from a war that felt more distant with every mile of American soil beneath him. He watched the landscape change through the window. The green density of the South replacing the bombed rubble of France, and felt something tighten in his chest that hadn't been there when he'd stormed the beaches or dug foxholes in frozen ground. His uniform still carried the creases from the Atlantic crossing, the bronze star pinned above his pocket catching light each time the train car swayed. Across from him sat two other men in uniform, both white, both asleep with their mouths open and their heads rolled back against the seats. Joseph hadn't slept since they'd crossed into Virginia. He'd been gone 3 years. 3 years of learning how to kill efficiently, how to follow orders without question, how to trust the man beside you even when the world was exploding and nothing made sense except survival. He'd learned other things too, that some French families would invite him to dinner, that English girls would dance with him in pubs, that a German bullet didn't care what color skin it punched through. For 36 months he'd been Sergeant Carter, respected by his unit, feared by the enemy, decorated for valor under fire. Now the train was slowing as it approached the town of Ashford, and Joseph felt himself shrinking inside the uniform that suddenly seemed too conspicuous, too bold a statement for what was waiting beyond the station platform. The conductor, an older white man with tobacco-stained teeth, stopped beside Joseph's seat as they pulled into the station. "You'll want to head to the colored waiting room," he said, not unkindly, but with the casual authority of someone stating a natural law, round the side of the building. "Can't miss it." Joseph nodded, picked up his duffel bag, and stepped onto the platform into the thick September heat. The air tasted like clay and kudzu and something else he'd forgotten. Fear, maybe, or the particular kind of tension that lived in his grandmother's warnings and his mother's careful instructions about how to move through the world. Two white men in civilian clothes stood smoking near the station entrance, and their eyes followed Joseph as he walked past, lingering on his uniform, on the medals, on the implicit challenge of a black man wearing symbols of authority and valor. He found his mother waiting in the colored section, smaller than he remembered, her face carved into new lines by 3 years of worry. She held him without speaking, her hands trembling against his back, and when she finally pulled away, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "You're home now," she said, though it sounded more like a warning than a comfort. That first week back, Joseph learned the geography of absence. He learned that the war had changed nothing about Ashford except which white boys had died overseas and which ones had stayed behind to inherit their father's businesses and prejudices. The drugstore still had 2 water fountains. The movie theater still made colored patrons climb the back stairs to the balcony. And the sheriff, a man named Hastings with a face like raw meat and eyes that assessed black citizens as potential problems, still drove his patrol car slowly through the colored neighborhoods each evening, a ritual of intimidation as regular as sunset. But Joseph also learned that he wasn't alone. 3 other veterans had returned to Ashford in recent months. Marcus Webb, who'd driven a transport truck through Italy and still flinched at loud noises. Raymond Price, a medic who'd seen enough blood to last several lifetimes. And Samuel Tucker, a quiet man who'd been a combat engineer and now worked alongside Joseph at the lumber mill. They found each other naturally, drawn together by shared experience and a common restlessness that made civilian life feel like poorly fitted clothing. They met most evenings at Raymond's house, a small place on the edge of town where his wife, Clara, made cornbread and listened patiently while the men talked in circles around things they couldn't quite name. "I spent 3 years over there proving I was a man," Marcus said one night, his hands wrapped around a glass of sweet tea. "I followed orders, I did my duty, I watched friends die. And I come back here and I still gotta step off the sidewalk when a white woman walks past. Still gotta say yes, sir, to boys half my age." "It's different now, though," Raymond said quietly, always the peacemaker. "We're different. We know what we're capable of. That's what scares them," Sam replied. He'd been whittling a piece of wood, not looking up, but his voice carried a certainty that made the others fall silent. "We're not supposed to know we can fight back. That's the whole system keeping us convinced we're less than, that we deserve what we get. But we've seen other places. We've been treated like men. That makes us dangerous." Joseph said nothing, but he felt the truth of it settle in his bones. Dangerous. Yes, that's what he saw in Sheriff Hastings' eyes, in the way white men watched them walk past the courthouse in their uniforms, in the sudden quiet that fell over the hardware store when they entered. They weren't just black men anymore. They were black men who'd been trained to kill, who'd proven they could follow complex orders and execute tactical plans, who'd survive combat and come home expecting some measure of respect for their service. That expectation itself was threatening to an order built entirely on their submission. The trouble started in October, 2 months after Joseph's return. A cross burned in Raymond's yard on a Tuesday night, the flames throwing orange light against the weathered boards of his house. the smell of kerosene and burning wood mixing with the autumn air. Clara had seen them from the window, for men in white robes, their faces covered, moving with the casual efficiency of a routine task. They'd planted the cross, doused it in fuel, lit it, and driven away in a pickup truck before Raymond even reached for the rifle he kept hidden beneath the bed. By morning, everyone in the colored part of town knew about it. By afternoon, the white part of town knew too, and there was a current of satisfaction running through the barber shop and the hardware store. The unspoken understanding that the veterans had been put in their place, reminded of the eternal order of things. But that evening, when the 4 veterans gathered at Raymond's house, there was no talk of leaving town or keeping heads down. Instead, Samuel spread a map of Ashford on the kitchen table, a map he'd drawn himself, marking every street, every house in the colored neighborhood, every possible approach route. They came from the east, he said, his finger tracing the road. Probably from the old tobacco barn where they have their meetings. That's 2 miles out. Gives them time to rope up on the drive-in. You're talking like we're planning a military operation, Clara said from the doorway, her voice tight with fear and something else, a reluctant pride, perhaps, or resignation to what seemed inevitable. Because that's what this is, Marcus replied. They declared war on us the minute they burned that cross. We can either run or we can defend our ground. I spent 3 years learning how to defend ground. Joseph looked at the map, seeing it the way he'd been trained to see terrain sight lines, cover positions, choke points, fields of fire. We can't just shoot at them, he said carefully. That would give Hastings all the excuse he needs to round us up, maybe hang us legal. But we can make sure they know we're ready to fight. We can make the cost too high for them to keep coming. How? Raymond asked. Organized defense, Samuel answered. We establish a perimeter. We man positions. We let them see we're armed and watching. The Klan relies on fear. They burn crosses and terrorize people who can't fight back. But if we show them we're prepared to defend ourselves, if we make it clear that coming into our neighborhood means possibly dying on our streets, they'll think twice. They talked until midnight, planning in the language of military tactics they all understood. They divided the neighborhood into sectors, identified families who could be trusted to keep watch, determined which men among them had weapons and knew how to use them. It felt both natural and surreal, applying the techniques they'd learned to kill fascists in Europe to the task of protecting their families from fascists in Georgia. News spread through the black community like water finding its level. Some families were frightened, worried that armed resistance would bring worse violence down on all of them. Joseph's mother was among them. Baby, you're going to get yourself killed, she told him, gripping his hands across her kitchen table. These white folks don't play. They'll burn down the whole neighborhood. Mama, they're already burning it down, Joseph replied gently. One family at a time, one cross at a time. I didn't fight a war to come home and be scared in my own town, not anymore. Others understood immediately. Old Murr Jenkins, who'd lost 2 sons to the war, offered to stand watch even though his hands shook with age. Mrs. Washington, who ran the colored school, organized the women to establish a telephone tree, a way to spread warnings quickly when trouble appeared. Young men who'd been too young for the war volunteered to act as runners, carrying messages between watch posts. The community was organizing itself around the veterans, building a structure of defense that felt both revolutionary and ancient, the same way people had always protected their own when no one else would. 3 weeks passed. The nights grew colder and men took shifts watching the roads into the neighborhood, armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, communicating with flashlight signals they'd established. Nothing happened, and the tension wound tighter, everyone waiting for the inevitable confrontation. It came on a Saturday night in November. Samuel was on watch in the old church steeple, the highest point in the neighborhood, when he saw headlights approaching from the east, not 1 vehicle but 6, moving slowly, deliberately. He flashed the signal, 3 quick bursts of light, and the neighborhood came alive in careful, practiced silence. Men moved to their assigned positions. Women gathered children into interior rooms, doors locked, lights extinguished. Joseph crouched behind a low wall at the intersection of Freeman Street and Oak Avenue, Marcus beside him, both men holding rifles they'd cleaned and oiled with the same care they'd used in France. Raymond was positioned across the street, Samuel up in the church with a bird's-eye view of the whole scene. The vehicles came closer, and now Joseph could see they were pickup trucks. Beds loaded with robed figures, white fabric ghostly in the moonlight. The lead truck stopped at the entrance to the neighborhood, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Then a man stepped out, no robe yet, but Joseph recognized him. Deputy Harris, one of Sheriff Hastings' men, a young guy with a reputation for cruelty toward black citizens. He stood in the headlights, surveying the dark street ahead, and Joseph could see him notice what others might have missed: the absolute stillness, the watching silence, the sense of a trap waiting to spring. "We know you're out there," Harris called into the darkness, his voice carrying false bravado. "We're here to remind you colored boys to remember your place. You might have played soldier overseas, but you're home now and things work different here." Joseph felt Marcus tense beside him, but he reached out a steadying hand. "Wait, not yet. Let them commit." 2 more men climbed out of the trucks, pulling on their white robes. They carried a cross, already constructed, already soaked in kerosene. They moved toward the church, clearly intending to burn it, to send the most devastating message possible. It was Clara's church, where she taught Sunday school. It was where Joseph's grandmother had been baptized. It was the heart of the community. Samuel's voice came from the darkness, calm and clear, carrying the authority of his military rank. "That's far enough." The 3 men froze. Harris's hand moved toward his hip, where his service weapon hung. "I wouldn't," Samuel continued. "You're standing in the middle of a kill zone right now. We have you surrounded, we have clear fields of fire, and every man here knows how to shoot. Some of us can hit a Nazi at 300 yards. You're a lot closer than that." Joseph heard movement in the trucks, confusion, fear. The sound of men who'd come expecting easy violence, discovering they'd walked into something else entirely. He stood up slowly from behind the wall, his rifle held ready but not quite aimed, letting them see his silhouette, his military bearing. Marcus stood too, then Raymond, then a dozen other men, appearing from shadows and doorways, all armed, all perfectly positioned, all silent. "Jesus Christ," one of the robed men whispered, loud in the sudden quiet. Harris tried to rally. "You're threatening law enforcement." "You're not in uniform, deputy," Joseph said, his voice harder than he'd ever heard it. "You're wearing a bedsheet and trying to burn down a church. That's not law enforcement. That's terrorism. And we're prepared to defend our homes against terrorists. We did it in Europe. We can do it here." The standoff stretched, seconds becoming minutes. Joseph could feel his heart pounding, could taste copper in his mouth, could hear the small sounds of men in the trucks checking weapons, trying to decide if this was worth dying over. The mathematics of violence hung in the air. They had numbers, but the veterans had position, training, and the moral certainty that came from defending their own ground. Finally, Harris stepped backward, hands visible, the cross falling from his companion's grip. "This isn't over," he said, but the words carried no weight. "Yeah, it is," Marcus called back. "You came to scare us. You came to remind us we're supposed to be afraid, but we're not afraid anymore. We've seen worse than you, and we've survived it. So either come correct with uniforms and warrants and the law on your side, or don't come at all. Because if you come like this again, we will defend ourselves. We will fight back. And some of you won't leave." The trucks reversed, turned, drove away into the darkness. The cross lay abandoned in the street, unlit, a symbol of fear that had lost its power. For a long moment after they'd gone, no one moved. Then, slowly, the neighborhood exhaled. Women emerged with children. Old folks came out onto porches. Someone started singing, soft at first, then building, an old spiritual, transformed by the moment into something like a victory song. Joseph felt Clara approach, felt her hand on his shoulder. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But if they do, they'll remember what happened tonight. They'll remember we stood our ground." Samuel climbed down from the church steeple, his face drawn but satisfied. "We should stay organized," he said. "Keep the watches going. They might try again, or they might report us to Hastings, make it official trouble." "Let them," Raymond said quietly. "At least then it'll be honest. At least then everyone will see it for what it is." The official trouble came 3 days later. Sheriff Hastings himself drove into the neighborhood, 2 patrol cars behind him, looking for the ringleaders of an armed insurrection. He found the 4 veterans waiting for him on the church steps, unarmed, surrounded by 50 members of their community who'd gathered spontaneously, a wall of witnesses. "You boys want to tell me what happened Saturday night?" Hastings asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Some men tried to burn our church," Joseph replied. "We stopped them. That's what happened. I heard you threaten Deputy Harris. We defended our property, our homes, our church. Deputy Harris was out of uniform, participating in an illegal action. We had every right to protect ourselves." Hastings' face reddened. "You had guns. You organized. That's conspiracy to commit. To commit what, Sheriff?" Mrs. Washington stepped forward, her schoolteacher's voice cutting through his bluster. "To commit the crime of not wanting our church burned down. To commit the crime of self-defense. These men served their country. They fought for freedom. They came home expecting to live as citizens, not as targets. If that's conspiracy, then we're all guilty. The sheriff looked at the gathered crowd, at the witnesses, at the unity he couldn't break with threats or intimidation. He looked at the veterans in their civilian clothes, standing with the dignity of men who'd earned their place. And something in his face shifted. Not acceptance, exactly, but a recognition that the old order had cracked, that something had fundamentally changed on that dark street 3 nights ago. "This isn't over," he said finally, the same empty threat Harris had made. "Maybe it is," Samuel replied. "Maybe it's just beginning to be over." The sheriff left, and the community dispersed, but everyone understood that something had shifted in Ashford. The word spread to other counties, to other towns where black veterans were returning, where the same tensions were building. In Monroe, Louisiana, veterans heard the story and organized their own defense. In Columbia, Tennessee, the pattern repeated. Across the South, men who'd fought fascism overseas were refusing to submit to fascism at home, and their refusal was changing the calculus of terror that had governed racial violence for generations. The Klan came back once more 6 weeks later, a larger group, more determined. But this time, when they reached the edge of the neighborhood, they found more than just the veterans waiting. They found a community that had learned to organize, that had built networks of communication and defense, that had decided collectively that submission was no longer acceptable. The confrontation was brief, no shots fired, but the threat of violence so clear, so mutual, that the Klan retreated again, and this time they didn't return. Winter came to Ashford. Joseph kept working at the lumber mill, kept living in his mother's house, kept attending meetings where veterans and community leaders talked about voting rights, about organizing, about the long struggle ahead. The fear hadn't disappeared. It couldn't. Not in a place where the law still served white supremacy, where economic power still rested in hostile hands, where violence lurked in every interaction. But something else had emerged too, something harder to name. On Christmas Eve, Joseph stood on his mother's porch, looking out at the neighborhood where lights glowed in windows, where children played in yards, where the church still stood unburned. Marcus came walking up the street, collar turned up against the cold, and stopped beside him. "You ever think about leaving?" Marcus asked. "Going north, where it's different." Joseph considered the question. He thought about the train that had brought him home, about the uniform he'd worn, about the war he'd fought for a country that didn't fully accept him. He thought about the night they'd stood their ground, about the way the community had come together, about the fact that they'd defended something worth defending. "It's not different up north," he said finally. "It's just different how they do it. But here we made them back down. Here we proved we wouldn't run." "That matters, does it?" Marcus's voice carried doubt. "We stopped them once, maybe twice. But the system's still the same. The laws are still the same. We're still second-class citizens who had to threaten violence just to stop our church from burning." "Yeah," Joseph agreed. "But we did stop it. And that's something. Maybe it's not enough, but it's something. It's a beginning." They stood in silence, 2 men who'd learned to kill and to survive, who'd come home to find that survival required different but equally fierce courage. The night was cold and clear, stars visible above the pines, and somewhere in the distance, someone was singing, the sound carrying through the winter air like a promise or a prayer. Raymond joined them, then Samuel. The 4 veterans gathered without planning it, drawn together by bonds that transcended words. They didn't talk much. What was there to say that they didn't already know? They'd fought one war and come home to another. They'd been soldiers and become defenders. They'd learned that freedom wasn't something granted, but something constantly fought for. Inch by inch, night by night, against enemies foreign and domestic. Clara came out eventually bringing coffee, and they drifted into Raymond's house where warmth and light waited. Joseph looked back once at the dark street, at the neighborhood they'd protected, at the church that still stood. He thought about the future, about how long the struggle might last, about whether his children would have to fight the same battles. But for tonight, this moment, they'd won something. They'd drawn a line and defended it. They'd proven that returned soldiers were not the same frightened boys who'd left. They'd shown that training and courage could flow both ways, that the skills learned fighting. Fascism in Europe could protect against fascism at home. It wasn't justice, not yet. It wasn't equality, not even close. But it was resistance, and resistance mattered. It was dignity, and dignity was everything. It was 4 men who'd refused to keep running, who'd stood their ground and survived, who'd carved out a small space of safety in a hostile land. The night they stopped running hadn't changed the world. But it had changed them, and maybe that was enough to begin with, enough to build on, enough to pass down, enough to keep the fight alive until the world finally caught up with the truth they'd learned in war. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to stand despite it, to defend what matters, to refuse submission even when submission seems like survival. Joseph drank his coffee and listened to his friends talk, their voices low and tired and alive. Outside, the Georgia night pressed close, full of dangers known and unknown. But inside, in this small house in this defended neighborhood, there was warmth and community and the quiet knowledge that they'd done something extraordinary, not by winning a war, but by refusing to lose the peace, one dark night at a time.